Basically, our task today as people in the cyber security realm is really about protecting our communities. It's about protecting our society. Indeed, it's about protecting our nation and our continent as a whole. And of course, very importantly, it's about protecting humanity. And so you
Sorry to
cannot
interrupt you,
really
sir.
protect.
Your camera is not on yet.
Yes.
Interrupt you.
Oh, my apologies. Well, I think seeing the screen is more important than seeing me. But anyway, but you can hear me. Okay.
Yes, we can hear you, sir.
So, uh, so you cannot protect one person alone. Basically, as we have seen, for example, from COVID, if we are not all protected, then in a manner of speaking, none of us are fully protected. And so really, we're not about securing computers or systems in of themselves. We are much more about securing our society. For some reason, my forward slash is not working. Uh, why is my screen not? Okay. So the cyber threat landscape is relatively complicated. Of course, it has all kinds of challenges, denial of service, challenges to networks. Certainly the loss or abuse of physical systems. We've seen the rise of social engineering. Uh, and also we've seen challenges in the various value chains, bearing in mind that unfortunately much of Africa does not control its own value chains. And I think this is why this notion of building indigenous capacity at all levels, whether it's people, processes, or technology, is extremely important. We've seen a case, I think it was last year in well, eastern parts of Africa, where smartphones from China actually had gotten infected with malware during, the manufacturing process. And basically that malware was in effect stealing people's information, but yet using their bandwidth, using their data to steal it. So it means that you are paying for the privilege of your own data to be stolen. And because the malware was inserted during production, your typical malware solutions could not remove it. And then we've now seen, especially the rise of geopolitical threats, whether it is uncontrolled currencies, digital currencies, be it cyber terrorism, be it climate change, and a host of what we would call non-state actors, but even some state actors. And then one of the critical areas is something called the fragmentation of technology. And of course, I think many of us in the audience are very familiar with challenges of malicious content. And of course, many of us, unfortunately, have been victims of one kind of scam or the other. Now, unfortunately, especially among African leadership, there is a misperception that cybersecurity is not really an African problem to solve. And this is really compounded at that level by a lack of awareness, a lack of consistent approach, and certainly a lack of consensus on cyber issues such as norms. Now, when we look at some of our definitions, again, just very quickly, cybersecurity for me basically is, a risk management proposition. To address it, we must focus on the people, on the processes, and on the technology. I put that acronym as PPT so that I can easily remember it. Now, under cybersecurity, we have issues such as cybercrime, cyber war, cyber terrorism, cyber diplomacy, and really cyber war basically are exploits to disrupt the activities of usually an opposition nation state or an opposition military. Interestingly, cyber war in of itself is intrinsically asymmetric. And that means a very, very small group, indeed an individual, can to some extent take on a much larger, quote unquote, army. And in terms of cybercrime, basically there must be a piece of paper, an act that says this activity is wrong and this is the penalty for it. And when we talk of cyber terrorism, there are certain criteria that it must meet in terms of, the target, the impact, the method of action, domain, tools of attack, and motivation. But this also begs the question, is cyber malfeasance committed by a known terrorist an act of cyber terrorism? And this is still up for a lot of debate. But as Barry Rivender Green in Singapore famously said, cyber criminals operate at the speed of light, while the good guys, especially law enforcement, operate at the speed of law. So there's a natural mismatch, and we have to be able to find a way on the positive side to be much more proactive, to think ahead, because those cyber criminals have some inherent advantages, which we must creatively counter. Now, the earlier speaker had spoken, I believe, that there was the problem of cybercrime, about $5 billion a year. And that's very important to bear in mind. But I think we should also bear in mind that every headache also has a solution. If you have a headache, you take an analgesic. When you take that analgesic, you have to remember somebody invented it, somebody mixed it, somebody manufactured it, somebody wholesaled it, somebody marketed it, somebody transported it, somebody retailed it. In fact, the young person in your compound that you sent to buy the headache medicine probably pocketed the change. So everybody's making money from your headache. And likewise, cybersecurity is a headache. And William McCanty of CERNU projects that within the next 10 years, the African cybersecurity market is going to hit between 15 and $30 billion US. Not the problem, the solution. And so, as the lawyers amongst us will say, I put it to you, what piece of that market is going to be yours? What piece of that market will be for your country? What piece of that market will be for Africans in Africa and also Africans in the diaspora? So can we think about making cybersecurity a societal profit center, not simply a cost center? Can we look at cybersecurity creating opportunities, especially jobs, creating wealth, and of course, as a byproduct, generating revenue? Now, in 2020, ISC Squared, which many of us are familiar with, did a global survey. And they found out that there's a vacancy of 3.12 million cybersecurity professionals. Today, young Africans are dying crossing the desert. Young Africans are dying crossing the Mediterranean. Can our society empower them as young knowledge workers so that indeed they can be flown, not just economy, but maybe even business class, because they have a value proposition? Don't forget, those same Africans crossing the desert and crossing the Mediterranean, even when they get to Europe, they become sort of a permanent underclass. But an empowered cybersecurity professional actually would be a respected diaspora, a respected expatriate. And so I think our society needs to begin to look at these kind of things. Don't forget, that diaspora that earns money will send home remittances. For those of us from Nigeria, we know that already the remittances from our diaspora is outstripping, oil remittances. But more importantly than that, the diaspora at some point may decide to come home. But even more important than that is that those that do not only come back with their expertise, but also come back with their relationships. If you or I send the letters to somebody in Europe or America, I mean, they'll probably just bin it. But if that letter comes from somebody they've worked for 3 years or 5 years, they have a relationship with, at least it will get read, at least it will get thought about. The UN is not left out in all of this. The UN has decided as a body that international law does apply in cyberspace. They've developed for now at least 11 norms. Norms are basically soft laws. And over time, as we've seen in outer space, as we've seen in nuclear technology and laws of the ocean, they can evolve into hard international laws that our countries must obey at the risk of becoming a pariah state. The UN has also engaged in confidence building measures and capacity building. The challenge for us in Africa is that we need a generation like you who can evolve into being cyber diplomats, those who use diplomatic tools and thinking to resolve cyberspace issues, especially between state actors. When these norms and other rules are being developed, African experts need to be at the table, not simply as token representation, but as respected peers. And I would challenge some of you listening today to consider cyber diplomacy as a career prospect. Unfortunately, as we all know, Africa has been a victim of imperialism. Many of us can, from history, will have read about the 1884-85 Berlin Conference. That is how Africa was partitioned. That's why tribes are split. That's why seemingly incompatible groups lie within the same jurisdiction. And unfortunately, this has moved into the cybersphere. We've seen where the challenges at Afrinic, where a single company in Hong Kong basically bought over 5% of Africa's IP4 allocation, 6.2 million IP4 addresses valued at about $150 million. Now, it must be understood that IP4 is basically, there's a global shortage. And in the first instance, Africa was only allocated 3% of the total IP4. But in places like North America and much of Asia, the IP4 address resource has actually run out. And that's why we are encouraged to move to IPv6. But the issue is that just one company was able to corral 5% and was reselling it at a very high premium outside the continent, especially in East Asia to Chinese websites that's maybe for gambling or pornography, because those IP addresses would have been outside strictly the immediate purview of the national authorities that those websites really want to stay under the radar. So again, these are the kind of things that people like yourselves in the audience really need to think about and come up with mechanisms to address. In the case of the Nigerian government has actually come up with a revised 2021 National Cybersecurity Policy and Strategy. Please go to www.cert.gov.ng. You can download it and read much more about it. Fundamentally, it has 8 pillars, and it's also defined some critical national infrastructure or critical national information infrastructure, and there are about 13 sectors. Now, we do have to understand that the sectors are convenient, but it's actually the cross dependencies that we should be worried about. And so Nigeria is going to need the help of young Nigerians who are cyber savvy to be able to look at some of the issues in terms of what are the cross dependencies, how do we actually make sure we protect this critical national information infrastructure. And the underlying thing here is that digital resilience is a very, very critical national and indeed continental imperative. In terms of the cybersecurity ecosystem in Nigeria, at the center you have the president supported by the National Security Advisor, and he in turn is supported by the Cybercrime Advisory Council. We also have the National Cybersecurity Coordination Center, which is yet to be approved by Mr. President, but it is in the policy, which would absorb the existing NG-CERT National Coordination Center as one of its departments. And so within that architecture, certainly under the private sector, many of us in the audience or many of you who are innovators would certainly be catered for and need to have your say. As you all know, cybersecurity, it really begins with each and every one of us. We are the first line of defense. We must practice good cyber hygiene. And just to focus very quickly on the issue of passwords, you can compare them to underwear. Please change them often. Please don't share them with friends. Of course, the business of saggy pants doesn't work. You need to be able to be a bit mysterious with your underwear. Don't expose them too much. Certainly, the longer they are, the better. Some people wear very, very tight and shorts, which may not be good for them. And certainly, like underwear, don't leave your passwords lying around. And for example, from a cyber hygiene perspective, I personally do not use WhatsApp. I've long ago moved to Signal, and I would be very surprised that any of us in the audience who seriously practice cybersecurity are still using WhatsApp, because you have to practice what you preach. WhatsApp does collect quite a bit of metadata or operational data about you, about each transaction, about each message, about each phone call, and Signal conversely doesn't. And really, you cannot sell what you do not collect, and you cannot hand over to the security authorities, even if they have a court order, information that you do not collect. So I would really encourage you to practice the cyber hygiene that as professionals you ask others to practice. As we move forward in the context of innovation, building and securing society, we need to understand what we want to do before we begin to define our goals. And part of the reason I really have a lot of respect for CC Hub and those within that ecosystem is that they have really pushed the issues of understanding that trying to conform with the status quo, trying to stay within comfort zones does kill true potential. And that's why I'm so happy when I see members of these kind of ecosystems pushing the boundaries, and I would encourage you to keep doing so. In terms of resilience, a good friend of mine, Nigel Inkster, basically has defined resilience as the ability of a system or domain to withstand attacks or failure, and in such events to reestablish. And I think reestablishment is very crucial. So you have to really be ready. You have to have situational awareness. Certainly you want to have some level of cyber defense, and so on and so forth. But the critical thing is that, can you reestablish yourself so quickly that in fact the end user doesn't even realize that there has been an incident or that it is under direct challenge. Unfortunately, especially in Nigeria, but I think across much of Africa, many of our organizations are still at level 1, really no resilience, especially in the digital realm. So basically inconsistent application of controls, and indeed no controls. We really need to move from that bottom left corner to the top right corner, where we can continue to operate even under sophisticated attack. This is where we need to move our organizations to, and I think this explains itself. So for example, the helicopter you see on the screen, this was a DARPA experiment. Basically, DARPA is also the father of the internet. And basically, they gave the research scientists, the first task was that this helicopter is under actual ongoing cyber attack, and it's flying. The first assignment was, can it land safely? Now, you'd want a military helicopter to land safely, even if it's under active cyber attack, because it may, for one, be carrying ordnance, munitions, weapons, bombs. So if it crashes, especially into a civilian area, of course, that can cause loss of life and a lot of damage. Not to speak of, or not to mention, the crew that are on board would probably be killed. So once they achieve that first goal, and this is speaking to the issues of resilience, the second goal was, can this helicopter under active cyber attack carry out its mission, go do what it has to do, and come back and land safely? And while this is a military example, the idea is, as you're developing your own systems, whether it's a fintech app or something else, can it complete its mission? Can it complete what the end user wants it to do, even while it's under direct and ongoing cyber attack. So this is the kind of challenge that you need to lay out for yourself and for your teams. Now, when we look at people like yourself, Africa's cybersecurity professionals, again, these three buckets: people, process, technology. Clearly, there is no patch for human foolishness or indeed gross human error. But we also have to remember that as people, cyber criminals also take the easiest route. Furthermore, we do have to continually boost consumer awareness. Today, our endpoints are actually people who are like the roadside food vendor. I've forgotten what they're called in Kenya, forgive me. But in Nigeria, we have Mama Alakara, Mala Meshai, Mama Okpa. They are now using these devices, these phones. They are now doing banking transactions, checking their balances. They are now receiving or transferring money. So we need to make sure that we protect those endpoints, which are our consumers. And of course, in terms of processes, without trust, nothing will work. If you do not trust an airline, you simply will not fly, that airline. Also, incident management demands, continuous improvement. And we must find ways to collaborate in gathering threat intelligence. Certainly, we must, build our capacities, especially at the institutional level, and especially things like procedures. I personally believe it's very important that Africa generally and countries within Africa articulate their philosophy, ethics, policies, and strategies and accountability frameworks. And certainly in the area of technology, we need localized security tools. I must emphasize, we need to build indigenous security tools and products. Indeed, our survivability as a people, as a continent, as our various nations depends on our ability to build indigenous solutions. So this is, I think, a very crucial issue that I need to emphasize. Now, again, it's really starts about people. We need to set up those pipelines, the human resource pipelines. We need to bring in, different people. We need to be able to filter so that we get the right kind of people, build their capacities, develop coordination, and of course, ensure that we have the right kind of culture and especially cybersecurity culture. And as I've advocated before, I believe that it is incumbent upon us in Africa to overproduce, because certainly we need to be part of that filling the 3.12 professional gap that is there worldwide, including Africa. Now, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, no society is going anywhere without 50% of its population, its women. And certainly, for many of our societies, we have an additional problem, and that is we are not also leveraging another 47% of our population, which is our youth. So really, we're not firing on all cylinders. And I think it's imperative that we make sure that our wives, our nieces, our sisters, our daughters look at IT security. It is interesting that even in conservative environments, the beauty of cyber is that you can work from home. So if for various conservative reasons, or you're afraid of a pandemic or security situation, once as a society we provide the right kind of connectivity and empowerment, who says that we can't work at home like many of us are doing right now? If we had said we couldn't do it pre-pandemic, there was no argument. But now we know that that is not true. We can accommodate our societal mores within the context of being a cybersecurity professional. So no one else can make Africa better unless we do. We do have to build our people, we do have to focus on our processes, and we do have to develop indigenous technologies. As I usually ask, who will protect the digital African? If not you and I, then whom? We do need to open our eyes to evolving areas. Certainly, cyber diplomacy is one, data privacy, predictive analytics. And if you are inclined to military, there's now things like mosaic warfare and mimetic warfare. But I think it's extremely crucial for all of us, regardless of where we are in the system today, and regardless of where we find ourselves tomorrow, that we always factor the underserved, the unserved, and the unborn. They are not at the table. But yet, the decisions that we make today, for those of you at the table or near the table or who advise the table, they will have to live with those decisions. So we do have to factor them, despite the fact that they're not here. I've mentioned this before, but I'll just throw it in. Cybersecurity ABCs, assume nothing, believe no one, and please check everything. Never easy to do, but sometimes that's what it takes to at least make sure that our society is actually protected. Asante, thank you very much.